And India's Ministry of External Affairs has firmly rejected China's efforts to rename locations in the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh.
China skipped a confidential G20 meeting held in India on Sunday, as per our sources. The meeting was held in Itanagar, the capital city of Arunachal Pradesh, a state that China claims is a part of Tibet.
20 Indian soldiers have been killed fighting with Chinese troops on a disputed border region, according to the Indian army and government sources.
China just launched an invasion of India. Not with missiles, tanks, or troops, but with maps, propaganda, and 1,000 tiny cuts. On May 12th, China's Ministry of Civil Affairs casually announced that they were renaming 27 different locations in Arunachal Pradesh, a massive Indian state stretching across nearly 90,000 square kilometers. A state that's been undeniably Indian territory for generations. China did the exact same thing in 2024. Again in 2023, when India hosted a high-profile G20 summit in Arunachal Pradesh. Before that, they did it in 2021, right after India's Vice President, M. Venkaiah Naidu, visited the state. They even did it back in 2017, after the Dalai Lama, a spiritual leader who China deeply dislikes, visited Arunachal Pradesh. You can clearly see the pattern, right? Every time India asserts itself or makes a significant diplomatic move in this region, China responds by renaming Indian territories and trying to claim ownership. All of this seems pretty harmless. Like, honestly, who cares if China randomly decides to rename a few places that India already fully controls anyway, right? But that's exactly where both you and I might be making a huge mistake. You see, history means something different to every country. Most nations look back at their history to understand their past, to learn from their mistakes, or to celebrate their achievements. But China sees history as a weapon. They use history strategically, carefully picking out bits and pieces that suit their agenda and erasing anything that they don't like or that challenges their claims. Most people don't realize this, but rewriting history and renaming territories is exactly how China slowly took control of Tibet, Inner Mongolia, East Turkestan, and Manchuria. All these places were quietly renamed, their histories rewritten piece by piece, until the world simply accepted that they were always Chinese. Even places like Hong Kong and Macau, despite their unique identities, eventually fell victim to the same tactic. China will never say enough. The more they take, the hungrier they become. And now, they're coming for a piece of India. In this video, we're going to unravel centuries of hidden history, peel back layers of misinformation, and reveal the real truth behind the India-China border conflict. Now, Chinese bots definitely aren't going to like this one, so it's entirely up to you to help us spread the truth. If you can please take a second and hit that like button and that subscribe button down below, it really helps out our work tremendously. We appreciate you. You see, if we go all the way back to around the year 625 CE, Asia looks completely different. Massive empires ruled huge chunks of land. India had powerful empires, China had its own dynasties, and right between them stood Tibet. The Tibetan Empire was so massive that its borders stretched far beyond today's Tibet, covering huge territories that we now recognize as parts of India's Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh. For about 2 centuries, the Tibetan Empire expanded aggressively in all directions, going toe-to-toe with China's Tang dynasty, one of the strongest empires China has ever had. In fact, for decades, Tibet and China were fierce rivals, constantly fighting wars, signing treaties, breaking those treaties, and then fighting again. That's how intense things were at the time. And by the early 1600s, the Ladakh kingdom had evolved into a confident, prosperous, and deeply Buddhist kingdom, famous for its beautiful monasteries, thriving culture, and busy trade routes. Ladakh also formed close relationships with other Buddhist kingdoms, particularly Bhutan, which followed a different branch of Buddhism. Bhutan was Tibet's fierce rival, both politically and religiously. So when Ladakh started aligning itself with Bhutan, this made the rulers of Lhasa extremely suspicious and uncomfortable. All these tensions eventually exploded into open conflict. In 1679, Tibet, under the direct authority of the 5th Dalai Lama, launched a major military invasion against Ladakh, sending thousands of Tibetan troops storming across the mountains. Ladakh was strong, sure, but they were no match for the massive Tibetan army at that moment. The Tibetans quickly overwhelmed Ladakhi defenses, captured important towns, fortresses, and key territories in a matter of months. In desperation, the Ladakhi king, King Delek Namgyal, turned to the powerful Mughal Empire of northern India. The Mughals were at their peak, incredibly strong and influential. Seeing no other choice, the Ladakhi king sent urgent appeals to the Mughal governor in Kashmir, Ibrahim Khan, begging for military assistance to push back the invading Tibetan forces. Ibrahim Khan mobilized a huge Mughal army, which eventually overwhelmed overwhelm the Tibetans, who had no choice but to pull back. For 5 exhausting years, Ladakh, Tibet, and their allies fought bitterly, until finally, in 1684, both sides were too tired and too worn down to keep fighting. They knew a lasting peace was necessary, and so the Ladakhi king and Tibet's 5th Dalai Lama came together to negotiate. That year, the historic Treaty of Qing was signed. Now, this treaty is extremely important because, for the first time, it clearly and officially drew the boundary between Ladakh and Tibet. In fact, the treaty specifically included a map that clearly marked the border at a landmark known as the Lahari Stream near Demchok. At that moment onward, Ladakh was officially recognized as a separate, independent kingdom, completely distinct from Tibet. Even today, this treaty is one of the strongest pieces of historical evidence that Ladakh was never truly a part of Tibet. We'll soon explain why this centuries-old treaty still matters so much today, and why China deliberately ignores it as if it never existed. But first, let's continue our story on how the Chinese got involved in Tibet. In the decades following the treaty, Ladakh continued to be ruled by its own family, although the kingdom gradually became less powerful and influential over time. Meanwhile, Tibet found itself threatened by invasions from powerful Mongol tribes called the Dzungars. Seeing an opportunity, China's Qing dynasty stepped in. Officially, the Qing emperors claimed they were just protecting Tibet from these Mongol invaders. But their real goal was to take control of Tibetan affairs. In 1720, Qing forces marched straight into Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, and swiftly drove out the Mongol invaders. But instead of leaving once their mission was accomplished, the Qing dynasty appointed an official governor known as the Amban to oversee Tibet. This marked the beginning of the never-ending Chinese involvement in Tibet's politics, culture, and territorial matters. From that moment on, Qing China actively influenced Tibet's internal issues, including political rivalries, diplomatic relationships, and crucially, border disputes, including those involving Ladakh. Throughout the rest of the 1700s, Tibet and Ladakh experienced a period of relative stability. But the early 1800s would soon bring another dramatic shift, one that would alter Ladakh's future completely. A new power had risen in northern India, the Sikh Empire. Based in Punjab and led by the legendary Maharaja Ranjit Singh, it was quickly becoming one of the most powerful and ambitious military forces in the region. Maharaja Ranjit Singh clearly understood how strategically important Ladakh was, especially because controlling Ladakh meant controlling critical mountain trade routes between India, Tibet, and Central Asia. So, in 1834, Ranjit Singh chose one of his bravest and most trusted generals, a legendary commander named General Zawahar Singh, to lead an expedition northward into Ladakh. Zawahar Singh's forces quickly overwhelmed the local Ladakhi resistance, decisively taking control of the region. In a very short period, Ladakh was firmly brought under the rule of Raja Gulab Singh of Jammu, a powerful ally and vassal of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. But Zawahar Singh didn't stop there. Ambitious, fearless, and eager for even greater conquest, he pushed his troops further north into Tibet itself. In 1841, he moved to capture the isolated barren yet strategically vital plateau we now know as Aksai Chin. Now, at the time, Aksai Chin might have seemed empty, remote, and insignificant, but this move to capture and control it would eventually set the stage for one of the biggest and most bitter territorial disputes between modern-day India and China. Now, at the time, Aksai Chin might have seemed empty, remote, and insignificant, but this move to capture and control it would eventually set the stage for one of the biggest and most bitter territorial disputes between modern-day India and China. But things didn't go according to Zawahar Singh's plan. Once his army marched into these harsh, freezing mountain regions, he quickly faced fierce and unexpected resistance. Tibetan forces, now backed by Chinese Qing troops, counterattacked with brutal strength and determination. Zawahar Singh's exhausted army was caught in the middle of a harsh Himalayan winter. Fierce fighting erupted in the mountains, and tragically, during a bloody winter battle, General Zawahar Singh himself was killed. His death threw his army into chaos, and the fighting reached a bloody stalemate. With no side clearly winning and both sides suffering heavy losses, leaders realized continuing fighting was pointless and costly, and so both sides reluctantly came to the negotiating table. In September of 1842, they signed another crucial agreement, known as the Treaty of Chushul, supervised closely by Qing China. Just like the last one, this treaty was so incredibly important because it officially reconfirmed Ladakh's historical borders and explicitly recognized Ladakh as territory belonging to Raja Gulab Singh's Dogra Empire. Crucially, it stated clearly that neither Tibet nor Ladakh would try to expand further into each other's lands. But here's what's really interesting about the Treaty of Chisul. China itself supervised and signed off on it. In other words, China officially agreed that Aksai Chin, the same region China controls today, was part of Ladakh, and therefore rightfully belongs to India. By that time, the British Empire had firmly established its rule across large parts of India, and Ladakh became part of their massive new territory. And, along with Ladakh, the British also inherited the border problems. The biggest threat was Russia. You see, Russia was rapidly expanding its empire in Central Asia. The British were genuinely terrified that the Russians might push south, cross the Himalayas, and threaten their control over India. And soon began what historians call the Great Game, a serious geopolitical competition where both empires tried to outsmart the other through daring expeditions, carefully placed spies disguised as monks and traders, secret diplomatic missions, and intense negotiations over remote border territories. Both empires raced to gain influence and control over key strategic areas before the other could reach them first. To deal with this massive geopolitical threat, the British first needed clear maps and reliable information. That's why, from the early 1800s through the rest of the century, they launched one of the most ambitious mapping efforts in history, the famous Great Trigonometrical Survey. British surveyors and explorers undertook dangerous journeys, venturing deep into uncharted territories of Ladakh, Aksai Chin, Sikkim, Bhutan, Himachal Pradesh, and the entire northeast region, today known as Arunachal Pradesh. Legendary Indian explorers like Nain Singh Rawat and Kishan Singh, working secretly for the British, disguised themselves as local pilgrims, monks, or traders. They risked their lives traveling through Tibet and even into Chinese-controlled regions, carefully recording crucial geographical and political information. These expeditions created detailed and accurate maps, marking crucial mountain passes, valleys, rivers, and strategic territories, often for the very first time in history. But mapping alone wasn't enough. The British quickly realized that having direct borders with large empires like China or Russia was extremely dangerous. So they set out to create buffer states, small, independent kingdoms friendly to the British, positioned strategically between their Indian territories and powerful rivals. Two of the most important buffer states were Sikkim and Bhutan. In 1861, Britain secured Sikkim as a protectorate through the Treaty of Tumlong, clearly marking its borders and controlling its foreign relations. This effectively put a small, friendly state between British India and China's Tibet, providing a critical defensive shield. Similarly, in 1865, after a brief conflict, the British signed the Treaty of Sinchula with Bhutan, again clearly defining its borders and ensuring peaceful relations. With Bhutan and Sikkim, the British created friendly barriers, independent kingdoms that kept China and Russia at a safe distance from British-controlled territory. Meanwhile, further west in Ladakh, things were even more complicated, especially around Aksai Chin. In 1865, a British surveyor, William Johnson, proposed a boundary line, now famously known as the Johnson Line, that clearly placed the whole of Aksai Chin firmly within Ladakh, and thus within British India. Interestingly, China never clearly rejected or officially objected to this line at that time, giving the Johnson Line significant historical weight even today. A later British official, George Macartney, proposed another border in 1899, placing much of Aksai Chin on China's side. But even here, China never really agreed clearly or responded, leaving confusion that still fuels arguments between India and China today. At the same time, something equally complicated was happening over in India's eastern frontier as well, the new region we now call Arunachal Pradesh. You see, back in 1914, British India decided it needed clear boundaries there too. So British diplomats met Tibetan representatives in Simla and signed the famous Simla Convention. Britain's negotiator, Henry McMahon, proposed a bold idea. They split Tibet into two distinct parts. First, an autonomous region called Outer Tibet, which would be under the Tibetan government in Lhasa and protected by China, but without direct Chinese interference. Then, second, a region known as Inner Tibet, covering the eastern provinces of Kham and Amdo, which would directly be controlled by China. But there was one more crucial part of this agreement, and perhaps the most controversial. They had to draw a clear border between British India and Tibet itself. To achieve this, Henry McMahon sat down personally with Tibetan representatives, and together they carefully marked out a boundary following the highest ridges of the eastern Himalayas. But there was one more crucial part of this agreement, and perhaps the most controversial. They had to draw a clear border between British India and Tibet itself. To achieve this, Henry McMahon sat down personally with Tibetan representatives, and together they carefully marked out a boundary following the highest ridges of the eastern Himalayas. Regions like Tawang, today part of India's Arunachal Pradesh, were clearly placed south of this boundary, within British India's territory. And this carefully negotiated boundary would soon become famously known as the McMahon Line. Initially, even China's representative at these Simla talks showed cautious acceptance. He actually initialized the draft treaty as a preliminary sign of agreement. However, soon after, Beijing rejected the treaty altogether. China's leaders argued that Tibet had no legal right to independently sign treaties or redraw boundaries, especially without explicit Chinese approval. Because of this objection, China refused to formally sign the Simla Convention. In the end, only Britain and Tibet officially signed and accepted the treaty in July of 1914. The British, however, treated Tibet as fully capable of making decisions. As far as the British were concerned, the McMahon Line was now official, clearly defining the border in the east. Later, when India gained independence from Britain in 1947, it accepted these British-drawn boundaries, including the McMahon Line, as its official border in the east. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was firm on the stance. He even published official maps in 1954, clearly showing these boundaries. He even declared, India's borders are what they are, map or no map. But China had a completely different perspective. After Mao Zedong's Communist Revolution in 1949, the newly established People's Republic of China totally rejected every boundary or treaty drawn up during the British era. Mao considered these old agreements, whether from as far back as 1684, the 1842 treaties, or even the Simla Convention of 1914, as unfair, forced upon China by foreign imperialists. Instead, China insisted it would accept only those boundaries it considered historically correct or traditionally recognized. In simple terms, this meant Beijing intended to redraw its borders on its own terms, no matter what maps or agreements existed before, and no matter how other nations felt about it. And this mindset paved the way for the aggressive territorial claims we see today, like the atrocious 10-dash line in the South China Sea, China's relentless claim over Taiwan, and disputes over many other regions. This deep disagreement is exactly why Arunachal Pradesh remains such a hotly contested territory today. India stands firmly with the McMahon Line drawn in the 1914 Simla Convention, while China flatly rejects it. But at the time, even with border tensions and disagreements, both countries publicly presented themselves as close friends. India's Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, genuinely believed in building a friendly partnership between the two great Asian civilizations. Astonishingly, Nehru even declined an incredible offer from the United States to take China's permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, insisting instead that China was the rightful holder of that position. A decision that, well, looking back now, many in India view as a colossal diplomatic mistake that the country still deeply regrets to this day. While Nehru was making these generous gestures, though, China wasn't exactly reciprocating the goodwill. Quietly, in the shadows, Beijing was steadily tightening its grip over Tibet. Just 1 year after Mao's Communist Revolution in 1949, Chinese troops aggressively pushed into Tibet, declaring they were liberating the region. A small and poorly equipped Tibetan army stood little to no chance and was quickly crushed. China even forced Tibetan representatives into signing the controversial 17-point agreement, officially confirming Chinese sovereignty and dominance over Tibet. In the following years, China's control became increasingly harsh and oppressive. Tibetan culture, religion, and independence were aggressively suppressed, and eventually conditions became unbearable. By 1959, the tensions exploded, and Tibetans openly rebelled against Chinese rule. Fearing for his life, Tibet's spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, fled to India, seeking refuge and safety. Even then, India was still trying to win over China's trust through practical, friendly gestures. In fact, in 1952, Nehru's government generously agreed to provide over 2,500 tons of rice to Chinese soldiers in Tibet, because China's own supply lines were overstretched. The Indian government genuinely believed that such gestures of goodwill would help build the lasting trust and friendships between the two neighbors. Unfortunately, this generosity backfired spectacularly. Behind closed doors, Chinese leaders privately mocked Nehru's kindness and dismissed it as a sign of weakness, even deriding his mindset as naive and bourgeoisie. Taking advantage of India's goodwill, China began quietly making aggressive moves behind India's back. Between 1951 and 1957, Chinese engineers secretly constructed a massive strategic highway right through Aksai Chin, territory India strongly believed belonged to them. This infamous road, known today as the G219 highway, stretched an astonishing 1,200 kilometers through barren, high-altitude terrain, connecting China's provinces of Xinjiang and Tibet. China built this huge road without even informing India, let alone seeking permission. India only discovered this shocking intrusion by accident, sometime between 1957 and 1958. Incredibly, it's said an Indian officer stumbled across a Chinese newspaper article openly mentioning the completed highway. India's government was totally blindsided. Prime Minister Nehru immediately reacted with shock and anger, publicly asserting India's territorial claims by publishing detailed official maps that clearly marked Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh as part of India. China responded with counterclaims. Things dramatically escalated in 1959 after the Dalai Lama's dramatic escape to India sparked global attention. Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai sent a sharply worded letter to Nehru, explicitly rejecting India's claimed border along the McMahon line in Arunachal Pradesh. Zhao also declared that the Ladakh border, including Aksai Chin, had never been properly defined. Diplomatic exchanges rapidly deteriorated into heated arguments. China justified its claims by citing historical reasons, like ancient caravan routes passing through Aksai Chin, and religious links connecting Tibet to Arunachal's Tawang Monastery. India firmly stood its ground, insisting the British-era treaties, clearly documented and historically signed, were entirely valid and non-negotiable. In 1960, Premier Zhou Enlai even tried offering Nehru a compromise, a so-called package deal. China would officially recognize India's claims in Arunachal Pradesh along the McMahon line if, in exchange, India accepted Chinese control over Aksai Chin. But Nehru flatly refused this deal, famously stating that India wouldn't surrender even an inch of Indian land. By 1961, tensions were rapidly escalating. Both Indian and Chinese militaries began aggressive patrols and set up forward outposts in disputed areas, frequently encountering each other. Minor clashes became increasingly common. Both sides felt a war was looming. The stage was now set, tragically and inevitably, for full-blown conflict. Finally, on October 20th, 1962, China launched a sudden and massive attack, coincidentally at the same time when the world was busy worrying about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The People's Liberation Army struck simultaneously in both disputed sectors. Aksai Chin in Ladakh, the west, Indian troops were isolated, ill-equipped, and far outnumbered, which is why China quickly secured the entire Aksai Chin plateau. Meanwhile, in the east, waves of Chinese forces crossed the McMahon line, rapidly overrunning Indian positions in the Namkachu Valley. Despite heroic resistance in several areas, Indian forces were poorly prepared and badly outnumbered. The Chinese advanced deep into Arunachal, even capturing the strategic town of Tawang. The war was short, but devastating. Thousands of Indian troops were killed or captured, and morale collapsed. Then, suddenly, China abruptly declared a ceasefire on November 21st, 1962. Even more surprising, they voluntarily withdrew their troops from Arunachal Pradesh, pulling back behind the McMahon line and allowing India to regain control. But in the west, China firmly kept control of Aksai Chin, roughly 38,000 square kilometers, never returning it to India, and they still hold it today. At this point, the term the Line of Actual Control, the LAC, was born. This became the de facto military border, the line where both armies stopped at the end of the conflict. But crucially, this LAC was never officially marked or agreed upon. Both India and China have different perceptions of exactly where this line runs, even how long it is, and disputes continue to erupt periodically along its undefined stretches. After the humiliating 1962 defeat, India worked hard to rebuild its military capabilities and rethink its China policy. Meanwhile, Mao's China considered its job done. As Mao said, China had taught India a lesson. For a while, uneasy peace settled at the borders, but it didn't last long. In 1967, tensions flared again at a high-altitude mountain pass called Natu La, situated right between the Indian protectorate of Sikkim and Chinese-controlled Tibet. Unlike 1962, this time India was better prepared, with troops ready and determined to fight back. A simple argument over border fencing quickly escalated into a full-blown gunfire. Both sides opened fire with mortars and machine guns. India's artillery fired back with devastating accuracy. After days of fighting, around 80 Indian soldiers were killed. But Chinese losses were even heavier, estimated between 300 and 400 soldiers. For India, despite the human cost, this fight at Natu La was a psychological victory, a strong signal to China that India wouldn't be bullied at the border anymore. The fighting at Natu La exposed another huge strategic vulnerability for India. The small Himalayan kingdom of Sikkim and the extremely narrow Siliguri corridor, commonly called the Chicken's Neck. The Siliguri corridor is just about 20 kilometers wide at its narrowest point and connects the entire northeast of India to the rest of the country. If this corridor were ever captured or cut off, India's northeastern states could be entirely isolated. Because of this, India was extremely sensitive about the security in this region. To better secure this vulnerable area, India formally annexed Sikkim in 1975, making it an official Indian state through a referendum, something China bitterly opposed and refused to recognize for decades. But still, vulnerability in the region still exists. Indian planners constantly worried about the possibility of Chinese forces cutting off the northeast by attacking near strategic points like Doklam, a fear that dramatically resurfaced decades later in the Doklam Crisis of 2017. After the bloodshed at Natu La in 1967, both nations seemed eager to avoid further military conflict. China was soon preoccupied with massive internal chaos during the Cultural Revolution, and India faced other challenges like wars with Pakistan and internal issues. By the late 1980s, both countries saw the benefit of calming border tensions. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi even visited China in 1988, initiating a fresh start. The two sides signed important agreements in 1993 and 1996, known as Peace and Tranquility Agreements, to maintain calm along their disputed border. One of the most unusual rules agreed upon in 1996 was the no guns rule. Both armies explicitly agreed not to fire guns or explosives within 2 kilometers of the LAC. Soldiers carried guns mostly for protection against wildlife, but had clear orders never to shoot during confrontations. Instead, any face-offs would be settled with kicks, punches, sticks, and stones, and no bullets. It might seem strange, but this rule actually worked well for decades, helping to prevent small arguments from spiraling into serious conflicts. Meanwhile, throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, China steadily improved its position along the disputed border. They undertook a massive infrastructure building spree, building and paving new roads, setting up air bases, establishing rail lines like the ambitious Qinghai-Tibet Railway to Lhasa in 2006, and creating frontier villages that appeared civilian but could easily serve military purposes. This extensive infrastructure enabled China to move soldiers and equipment swiftly along the LAC. But on the other side, India lagged behind, badly. Indian border roads remained poor or non-existent. Partially by intentional design, India believed that poor roads might slow down a potential Chinese invasion, and partially due to bureaucratic inefficiencies, environmental concerns, and political issues common in a democracy. For decades, Indian analysts warned about this imbalance and pushed the government to catch up. It often took Indian troops days to reach sensitive border areas that Chinese soldiers could have driven up to within hours. Finally, India woke up to this gap in the late 2000s, and especially the 2010s. Pouring billions of dollars into improving border roads through agencies like Border Roads Organization. But the bigger problem than the infrastructure gap was China's cunning strategy at the border, something the people called salami slicing. Instead of launching a large, obvious invasion, China would slowly and carefully chip away at border territories bit by bit, taking small slices of land at a time. The PLA would move slightly forward, preventing Indian patrols or local herders from accessing certain regions, and then quietly claim these areas as having always belonged to China. Over time, these tiny slices added up significantly. By early 2020, before the deadly clash at Galwan Valley, Indian observers were already warning that China had gradually shifted the LAC westward in many areas. According to an internal report, Indian forces lost regular access to 26 out of 65 traditional patrolling points in eastern Ladakh. Over time, Chinese troops gradually blocked Indian patrol routes, creating what they called buffer zones. Essentially now areas controlled by China, even though they were historically patrolled freely by Indian soldiers. Important strategic areas, like the Depsang Plains, where Indian patrols haven't been allowed since 2013, and places near Pangong Tso and Gorga quietly slipped out of India's grip, effectively becoming off-limits. Combine this with China's ongoing tactic of renaming Indian territories and rewriting history, and you've got a perfect storm brewing at the border. At this point, it's not a question of if, but when China will attack next. And given that both of these Asian giants possess nuclear arsenals, there's no telling if or when a new conflict could escalate dangerously close to a breaking point. But it's also important to realize that China's gradual invasion doesn't always stay bloodless. Take Doklam in 2017, for example. Like we mentioned earlier, Doklam overlooked India's incredibly vulnerable Chicken's Neck. When Chinese troops suddenly began extending a road into Doklam, a territory Bhutan says is theirs, India immediately stepped in at Bhutan's request. Indian soldiers moved in and blocked the construction crew physically. Both armies stood just meters apart, eyeball to eyeball, for over 2 months. The situation was extremely tense and came dangerously close to a full-blown conflict. Eventually, diplomatic pressures made both sides back off. China stopped building, and India withdrew. Then, in 2020, as the world was busy fighting COVID-19, China quietly moved thousands of soldiers forward at several key points in eastern Ladakh. It started around a lake called Pangong Tso, where both armies patrolled regularly along ridges called fingers. China suddenly moved forward, blocking Indian soldiers from patrolling their usual routes. Similar Chinese advances took place in other critical areas like Gorga, Hot Springs, and Depsang. India quickly rushed reinforcements, leading to a tense standoff. Then on June 15, 2020, tensions escalated in the Galwan Valley. Soldiers fought with their bare hands, stones, clubs wrapped in barbed wire, and metal rods with nails in them. By morning, 20 Indian soldiers were dead. China officially admitted to only 4 deaths, but independent reports indicated their losses were over 40. Galwan deeply shocked and angered India, shattering any remaining trust. Although the government tried to avoid escalation, public outrage forced India to toughen its stance. After Galwan, India and China held multiple negotiations. They agreed to partially disengage and create what they called buffer zones. But, like I explained earlier, these zones ended up causing more trouble for India. Even today, China has kept up its relentless strategy of biting away bits of India's territory, trying repeatedly to provoke a reaction, constantly testing India's patience and pushing it closer and closer to another major confrontation. And the 1,000 cuts we talked about in the intro, that's exactly where other nations come into play. You see, India is surrounded by several smaller countries like Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Pakistan. Historically, these countries acted like a protective barrier, a natural buffer keeping China at a safe distance, or at least they used to. Traditionally, these neighbors leaned towards India, but over the years, China has carefully and steadily chipped away at India's influence, using the exact same tactics of land grabs, relentless economic pressure, and, when nothing else works, bribery and political manipulation. Bangladesh has already tilted heavily towards China. Sri Lanka is practically trapped in Beijing's debt grip, and Pakistan has willingly become China's puppet, and it might only be a matter of time before others follow. And once they do, every one of these neighbors would deliver their own tiny cuts. Illegal infiltration from Bangladesh flooding India's border states, terrorist attacks supported by Pakistan, Sri Lanka handing strategic ports directly to Chinese hands, Nepal subtly shifting its alliances away from India towards Beijing. You get the idea. Individually, these incidents might seem small and isolated, but when you add them up over time, months, years, the damage becomes catastrophic, just like thousands of tiny cuts slowly bleeding India out. Take Bhutan, for example. For decades, this tiny Himalayan kingdom has looked up to India as its protector and ally. And it still does, which is why China is slowly encroaching into Bhutanese territory. Satellite images and leaked reports reveal China quietly building entire villages, military outposts, and infrastructure deep within Bhutan. Areas like the sacred Galwan Valley, which is central to Bhutanese cultural identity, now has Chinese flags flying over them. And Bhutan, with its small army and limited resources, can't do much other than just protest. Then there's Nepal. Historically, Nepal has been culturally close and politically aligned with India. But over the past decade, Beijing's presence in Nepal has grown tremendously. Chinese money now pours into Nepal, funding highways, airports, power plants, and infrastructure projects. Nepali leaders often lean towards China, giving in to pressure from Beijing, even cracking down on Tibetan refugees living within their borders to keep China happy. And there have been reports of quiet Chinese encroachment into Nepali territory as well. Villagers and local officials in Nepal's Humla district claim Chinese border markers have moved mysteriously, eating into their land bit by bit. Sound familiar? Next is Bangladesh. For decades, Bangladesh maintained a close friendship with India, sharing historic ties. But lately, China's economic investments in Bangladesh have skyrocketed. Massive infrastructure projects, deep-sea ports, and special economic zones are popping up across Bangladesh, funded by Chinese loans. Not to mention that they come with strings attached, carefully designed so the borrowing nation struggles to repay them. When the debt inevitably piles up, China steps in, not as a helping hand, but to claim strategic assets or political concessions. Maybe that's why, on Beijing's command, Bangladesh is sending millions of Bangladeshi migrants across illegally into India, creating demographic stress and sometimes sparking communal tensions. It's an indirect, subtle challenge, one of those 1,000 small cuts. Sri Lanka's case is even more clear-cut. When Sri Lanka struggled to pay back huge debts from Chinese-funded projects, China conveniently stepped in. Not to forgive the debt, no, but to take control of critical assets. The Hambantota port, strategically located along key shipping routes, is now effectively Chinese territory, leasing to Beijing for 99 years. From there, China could potentially dock naval ships. India is now forced to deal with a Chinese presence directly to its south. Even Myanmar is increasingly falling into China's orbit. Chinese companies dominate Myanmar's economy, and China funds rebel militias in Myanmar's borderlands, creating chaos and instability right along India's northeastern border. And lastly, there's Pakistan, India's arch nemesis, which has practically become a Chinese puppet at this point. But Pakistan is a bit different. China openly calls Pakistan its iron brother, and has invested tens of billions into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a huge infrastructure project that runs through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, land that legally belongs to India. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Pakistan has, for decades, systematically supported, funded, and sheltered terror groups aimed directly at India. These groups, like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, have carried out brutal attacks on Indian soil. Mumbai in 2008, Pathankot in 2006, Pulwama in 2019, and most recently, Pahalgam in 2025, killing hundreds of innocent civilians and soldiers. And it's no secret who backs them. Pakistani intelligence services, notably the ISI, have openly trained and equipped terrorists, using terror as a direct weapon against India. Now, with China's support, Pakistan feels bolder than ever. Beijing provides Pakistan with diplomatic cover at the UN, shielding known terrorists from sanctions and global blacklists. Then there's the human side. Pakistan's oppression in POK and Gilgit-Baltistan. These areas are rightfully India's territories, yet they suffered decades of atrocities. Political repression, human rights abuses, forced disappearances, torture, and relentless suppression. Pakistan is perhaps the sharpest knife in China's arsenal, one that has already inflicted hundreds of deep, painful cuts to India. When you step back and look at this whole picture, you see exactly how dangerous China's strategy really is. Slowly, quietly, methodically, China is cutting off India's influence, isolating India in its own backyard. They're gradually weakening every neighboring ally, strategically bribing or bullying smaller nations into submission, and slowly eroding India's borders inch by inch through relentless propaganda, historical revisionism, and subtle, calculated aggression. By renaming towns in Arunachal Pradesh, rewriting historical records, building illegal infrastructure deep inside of Bhutan, flooding Bangladesh's border with economic traps, turning Pakistan into a terror-sponsoring puppet, and systematically spreading misinformation behind their massive Great Firewall, China is slowly reshaping reality itself. This is exactly why understanding China's information warfare is crucial. Because recognizing these small cuts today could mean the difference between preserving your nation's borders tomorrow or waking up one day to find the map has been completely redrawn. Thanks for watching.